like people, horses have off days, and by looking at them before they actually get on the racetrack, you get an initial impression of which way they're leaning.
This is going to sound crazy, but for me, it's intellectual stimulation.
Class is now in session. It's time for Night School. Here are your hosts.
Welcome in, everyone, to Night School, the national online fan education program for player development and to make you a more confident player at the races. I'm Jeremy Plonk from Horse Player Now as we're back in Season 8, and we hit our October edition. Is it the hunt for the red October or a green October if you're a horse player? I think the green is more appropriate, not only for Keeneland, but hopefully we can collect some cash and help you at the windows. Joining me on the panel tonight, Bob Neumeier, Brian W. Spencer, and Caton Bredar. Let's say hello to the esteemed panel. First, Caton, how are you?
Hey, I'm great and excited. I love this season, and if we ever can get a winner, it'll make it even better.
Caton was doing some double duty this weekend at Keeneland and doing some Arc de Triomphe coverage, so she's got some international flair and some good thoughts towards the Breeders' Cup. Neumeier, what were you doing this weekend?
They call me the Space Cowboy. They call me the Gangster of Love. With Steve Miller. Yes. What was I doing? What was I doing? I was sitting on my couch watching the races from Keeneland and Belmont and betting several of them. I must say, without much success on Saturday, but hey, today's a different day.
And I know you were catching some baseball, too, along the way. Spence, how about you?
Absolutely, yes.
Well, about me, it's been the start of hockey season has been the best point for me. The races at Keeneland have been kind of hit or miss. I've been getting some decent horses. They just unfortunately are coming in the races that I'm not betting very heavily. So such is the Keeneland meet, but enjoying the fall sporting landscape as a whole, and still plenty of time left to get the ship righted at Keeneland for me.
No doubt, and it's a great time of year for horse players. It's kind of like that second ramp up. We have it in April towards the Breeders' Cup or towards the Triple Crown in May, and then this October run up towards the Breeders' Cup that we have in October. We're going to talk some different topics tonight in Night School, some that are, as we try to rip from the headlines, if you will, kind of the SVU of fan education. We take from the headlines the anatomy of an upset. If you watch Keeneland this past weekend, you know for sure that there was a ton of upsets, and what makes for a good upset and where do we look for them? We'll talk about that tonight. Biases, are they real or imagined? We'll look ahead to the Breeders' Cup at Churchill Downs coming up in a couple weeks. And is there an edge at racing at Churchill Downs in the past? Or do horses come in just the best horses win, or does that horse-for-course angle play out at Churchill Downs? We'll talk about your confidence in wagering, and when does it wane, when does it gain, and also jockeys that you'd like to see ride in a big race. Who do we want to see on our horses with the big money on the line? We'll talk about that and more, and some impromptu topics as well over the course of the next hour or so. We'll be joined a little bit later by Steve Byk as well for his thoughts on the most timely topics in racing. All right, panel, let's talk about the anatomy of an upset, because if you were watching the races this past weekend, Keeneland specifically, but some other tracks around the country, you got your fair share of them. How about Nick Scherz winning the Grade 1 Shadwell Mile, 23-1? You had Nick's Go win the Claiborne Breeders' Futurity at 70-1. Those were one of four winners at Keeneland that paid $50 plus over the course of opening weekend, and 13-1 shots won as prevalently as favorites did in the first week of racing at Keeneland over the first 31 races. So it was definitely a lot of feast or famine, depending on your end of picking long shots. Let's start with Neumeier here on the anatomy of an upset. What kind of horses create the big prices? I mean, is it head scratchers or is it situational?
Well, two things come to mind right off the top, Jeremy, and one is, an open race, and by that means several of those you kind of scratch your head at and say, well, any of them can win. Now, many players like to push the all button in horizontal wagers. I'm not particularly one of them because I think that all is a disaster, to be honest with you. I think it's just wasting too much money. But having said that, there are examples. The Shadwell race, for one, was one that I couldn't pick to save my life, so I would just pass and let it fly. So that's one obvious example of upsets that can happen. The other one I think is always to look for is, if you look at the odds, and I think this is true, if you look at the odds, and I think this is true, if you look at the odds, and I think this is true, if you look at the odds, and I think this is true, if you look at the odds, and I think this is true, if you look at the odds, and I think this is true, if you look at the odds, and I think this is true, if you look at the odds, and I think this is true, if you look at the odds, and I think this is true, if you look at the odds, and I think this is true, if you look at the odds, and I think this is true, if you look at the odds, and I think this is true, if you look at the odds, and I think this is true, if you look at the odds, and I think this is true, if you look at the odds, and I think this is true, if you look at the odds, and I think this is true, if you look at the odds, and I think this is true, if you look at the odds, and I think this is true, if you look at the odds, and I think this is true, if you look at the odds, and I think this is true, if you look at the odds, and I think this is true, if you look at the od when there is a lonesome speed horse. And sometimes it just happens by accident. And I want to give you last Saturday's first race at Belmont, where a preposterous long shot won by the name of Dark Tricks in a 5-horse field. Now, how can that happen? Well, the horse has some form about speed. This was a known as a 1 New York bred in a 5-horse field. $1 billion to 1. Low-level connections, that's important as well. Again, to repeat, if the jockey and the trainer are not fancied by the public, hence a big upset is possible. But generally speaking, if there's a possibility of a lone speed, or what we call a lone F, that is potential for a big upset. So in Belmont, if people recall that race, Dark Tricks won it wire to wire, just hung on at $1 billion to 1. 5-horse field, one of the fillies, who was 2 to 5, didn't break very well, had to show speed. Another filly, Miss Sizzle, was highly fancied, didn't break much at all, was an easy candidate for a bounce. Filly sprinters are bounces all the time. So this horse wound up on the lead and went wire to wire, hung on by a skinch. I don't know what it paid, 38 to 1, 40 to 1. Same thing happened on Thursday on the turf at Belmont. Notice I spend a lot of time focusing on New York, and same idea, that stuff happened behind him or her, and they made the lead and made a lonesome lead. And as I tell anybody who's willing to listen, sometimes these horses just forget to stop. So anytime you can concoct a scenario where you think a horse has a lonesome lead and is a big price, it's well worth it to give it a go. Usually it doesn't happen, but if it does, it pays big time, i.e. last Saturday at Belmont, race 1.
Yeah, and to take that to what we saw at Keeneland with Nick Sco, the 71 winner of the Breeders' Futurity, Caton, after the race, when the trainer, Ben Colebrook, was interviewed by Jesse Ullery from Keeneland, he was laughing. He said, "What happened?" He's like, "I don't know. We got lucky. Albin took the horse out to the lead, and nobody respected him, and we just stole it." And like Neumei's talking about, lone speed and an uncontested lead can sometimes result in some of these major payoffs. I mean, otherwise, it's hard to explain a horse like Nick Sco.
For sure. But there, and Neumei makes a great point. There are, though, the situations where maybe you can look at the race and kind of conceive of a lone speed situation beforehand. And then there are other races where it would be hard to have envisioned that this horse was going to be alone on the lead. But a lot of things happened, and I think that's key, too, to maybe considering if you're looking for the types of races that might yield long shots. For example, in that race, in that Futurity, you had fairly late, not during the races, but just before race day, scratch of the favorite. Anytime that happens, it kind of sometimes it causes a little topsy-turviness in terms of your handicapping, because Mind Control, who was the main speed horse and was going to be the favorite, scratches the morning of the race because of a fever. So now you need to go back to the drawing board and look at the race really closely without that horse in it. But I think sometimes the betting public as a whole kind of forgets that step. And you thought initially that there was a tremendous amount of speed, but maybe now, especially with his absence, there isn't quite as much. The other thing that happened is in that race that you couldn't have predicted, Dreammaker grabbed a quarter. He actually had to check very, very hard in the early stages of the race, and that kind of took him out. So there are some circumstances where you really couldn't have figured that the favorite was going to clip heels or almost clip heels and shack and be out of the mix right away. But then there are other scenarios where you could figure that maybe there is going to be potential for a big payoff because people forget about. I'll give you another example, and this does happen more often than you would expect. But when races come off the grass and there's main track only entrants still in, sometimes they get forgotten. And those horses can sometimes go off at decent prices depending on the size of the field. And that can yield that upset long shot situation. So to me, sometimes the key in terms of sussing out the long shots is paying attention after you've done all your handicapping. You know, we always encourage everybody to do your homework, handicap, be prepared when you walk in there, but you also have to adapt to the changes that come up last minute and really pay attention to how that might change the race. And does it open up the door for a potential long shot?
Couple great points brought up there about pace in terms of trying to find upset winners, changes into the body of the field like Caton had mentioned. Neumeier touched on, connections, and Caton touched on that. Look, people bet people in this game. I mean, that's just kind of the way that it is. The best trainers, the best jockeys take the most amount of money. We talk about these upsets like just specifically that happened at Keeneland. When you're looking down the trainers roll, and it's Ben Colebrook, Tim Gleishall, Doug Anderson, and Richard Baltuson from California, and it's Albin Jimenez and Edgar Morales on two of them, and Tyler Gaffalione. These are not Keeneland regulars. These are not top fives in the standings that we're used to seeing bet all the time. The anatomy of an upset a lot of times can be a good horse with connections that people don't normally bet. Brian, the money doesn't always follow the people, or the horses, I should say, in the same proportions that it does the people.
Yeah, and I don't want to, I'm not one to rain on anybody's parade after coming up with a $142 winner, but I don't know, honestly, going back in advance of us recording this, I don't know still that Knicks Go is a horse who, even if you're digging for an upset, even if you're digging for the lone speed, I still don't understand how a race like that plays out. They go 23-3, 47-2, very well within reason for that kind of trip for opening weekend at Keeneland. And, sure, maybe he's quickest early, but there's seven other horses capable of going a sub-23 opening quarter in that field, even with the scratch of Mind Control. How is a horse like Knicks Go going on a comfortable loping lead? It's nothing really, I think, but disrespect from other riders, and I would assume, going up the backstretch that I thought he was going to stop too. But that being said, that kind of easy lead, at least to my eyes, even with Mind Control, the speedy favorite coming out, I still can't put any single horse in that race on that soft of a lead. I think that may have been a lot of good fortune for those connections, which the barn seems to kind of have agreed with me on that one, because even with the speedy favorite coming out, there's no way I can envision that race being run in that manner as they're coming to the 5/16 pole and Knicks Go is having the time of his life on the front end and everybody else is going the wrong way. So sometimes the anatomy of an upset is extreme pace dynamics one way or the other. I think that's the best way for me to try to find big long shots, when there's either too much pace to an extreme, zero pace to an extreme, and vice versa with horses coming from off the pace. But I don't know if I think Knicks Go is kind of an outlier in the sense of trying to come up with those big number horses, because still, even being honest and objective going back, I don't think there's no way if they run that race again that I would still take him knowing what was about to happen.
Yeah, 2 points, Brian, about that. And one of them is you talk about a race when you look back and you say, well, this is inexplicable. It happens all the time in racing. I mean, I go back always and look at a race and say, what did I miss? What's going on here that I should have picked up on? Well, every once in a while I just shake my head like Knicks Go and say, well, stuff happens. So right away, anytime you're involved in a race where you're in the horizontal handicapping, whether it's pick 3, pick 4, daily double, 5, 6, it's kind of a blessing and a curse. The blessing is if you hit, then you're really well paid. The curse is, there's nothing you can do about inexplicable results. So you have to understand that that's part of racing. Point B, extremely important. Saturday's Belmont, 2-year-olds race 3. Brad Cox, I Am Spartacus, 6-5 with Joel Rosario. Why? I don't know. Did he have the breeding? No. Did he have the jockey? Well, people like Rosario, and certainly Brad Cox. Let's say he's a 2-year-old first-time starter winner, and he's 22% or 24%, which is pretty damn good. You know what that means to me? That means he's wrong 3 out of 4 times. He's wrong 5 times. So if I see Chad Brown in the entries, if I see Todd in the entries, if I see Baffert in the entries, or Cox or any of these guys, they're going to win X% of the time because they're good at what they do. I get that. But that's not where I want to go. I want to go where someone else shows up. And so, again, we talk about value and return. So, Jeremy, to your point, I would say, by and large, when big names win, I'm probably not on them, to be honest with you.
Right, and I think class is something that, can be perceived by handicappers rightly or wrongly, and we can talk about whether it even really exists in today's game, but I think it exists on the tote board. Horses that are disrespected in class but maybe in good form are almost universally overlooked, and we talk about the anatomy of an upset, and I know from our guys who have done the buzz over the years, and Spence being one of them, and Caton and Neumeier, you've been involved in it. I mean, some of the best plays and some of the biggest payoffs we've had over the years have been horses in really good form stepping way up in class. I mean, it's just a situation where people do not respect that resume, and that's where you seem to get some of the bigger prices.
And you
look at Jockey Club Gold Cup. Just excuse me, Kate. One point about stuff that you can't really explain. You would have had to make a scenario to me that maybe Diversify was a little bit slightly off form. But did we really know that Mendelssohn was going to go after him as quickly as he did? Did we know that going in? Well, yes and no. Maybe it could have, maybe not. But that set up another anatomy of an upset. When Discreet Lever came down and won the race by a nose, well, he benefited to me from a hellacious suicide pace at 1.25 miles. So this race was set up for stuff to happen, and it did happen. And that horse won, no disrespect, fair and square, but I would presume that if Diversify had an easy lead, things might have been a little bit different than what we saw in the Jockey Club Gold Cup.
Go ahead, Kate.
And to pick up on kind of a little of what you all touched on earlier, and Neumeier kind of made this point as well with connections, but I would say even a step farther, when you have situations where there's a lot of unknowns and there's a heavy, heavy favorite. I mean, for instance, yesterday in the Frizette, Kofefi goes off odds on, very, very short price. Now, this is a very fast filly, again, from the Brad Cox barn, but she broke her maiden. Now she's got to travel to New York to a different track. She's got to stretch out to 1 mile for the first time, and she's kind of an unknown against some of the more seasoned horses. That was potential for upset. No matter how much you like the horse, it's very hard for me to bet a horse like that. I may think she's the most logical winner, but there is no way I'm going to bet her, and I may take advantage of it because you're going to get a good payoff. The horse that won the race, Jaywalk, was a very playable horse if you weren't enamored with or caught up in the hype of the favorite. So, she ordinarily would be paying single digits. So I think that you look and follow the same rules that you do in general. There was an old adage, don't take a short price on a horse doing something they've never done before is a good one to live by, but also use it to your advantage in terms of looking for the logical horse that has done something or has more going for them that might be the bigger price.
Spence, why don't you put a exclamation point and punctuation on this discussion of upsets? Your final thoughts.
Well, I think looking back, I'm glad Neumeier brought up the Jockey Club Gold Cup, because I think that's the kind of situation where, I talked earlier about the Breeders' Futurity and how even going back, there's no way I can see that pace being that soft. But in the Jockey Club Gold Cup, that's a really good race to look at, because at least on paper, it had that potential, and it had that potential where one of the horses who was going to be up on a potentially quick pace was going to be the heavy favorite, Diversify. So I think that's one of those that made at least a little bit more sense. I still thought Diversify was going to be too good, but long story short is that may be kind of the key to finding the races where you can at least start to think about getting your big long shots. Is there at least some reasonable potential? Do we have a horse who can keep Diversify honest? Sure, it's Mendelssohn. Sure, there's some other speed in there too. So if we see that, and we see that now your very heavy favorite is going to be part of what at least is possibly a very negative scenario for that horse's running style, maybe that is kind of the key to starting to look for a long shot. Jockey Club Gold Cup made a lot more sense to me to have a huge price in the way the race was run than did the Breeders' Futurity at Keeneland last weekend.
Let's switch topics now, and something that dovetails what we saw with the anatomy of the upset and our discussion there. your confidence as a bettor and a handicapper. Nothing can shake you more than just being completely wrong repeatedly. And it happens to all of us. It happens to the best of us. My personal example at Keeneland, the first 2 days of the racing meet, they ran 21 races. I picked one winner out of 21. Promises fulfilled, who played a whopping $3 and change in winning a 5-horse field. It happens. The tide turned on Sunday for no other reason than if you're pretty good at what you do and you stick to your craft, eventually the numbers can kind of come back around to you. I had a very good first half of the card on Saturday, good enough to hit the early exotics and make up for the first 2 horrible days of the meet. Confidence waned, confidence gained. You start thinking in your mind after having a couple bad days, how am I going to get out of this? Or what am I doing wrong? Sometimes you just have to kind of go back and reassess what you've seen. I mean, consider the Keeneland scenario. Opening day of the meet on Friday, they had 3 inches of rain overnight on Thursday. Turf course tremendously soft. The dirt was drying out throughout the day. Track conditions can throw you off for sure. The beginning of any race meet, especially a melting pot like Keeneland, for a lot of longer meet players, like if you're going to play Belmont that runs for a long length of time, or one of these meets that Gulfstream, you may lay off the first week or 2 of the meet until you get a feel for it. You can't do that at a Keeneland, so you've kind of got to assess, what you're betting into, and maybe 1 for 21 isn't that you're completely looking at the ball wrong. It's just that these situations are tough. They're meant to be tough. They stack up that way. The weather conditions, the newness of a meet. Stick with your guns and things can work out for you. And for me, it turned the corner on Sunday. I will say this, that because of my workload, I handicap ahead. I had already handicapped Sunday's card before Friday's card started. So I didn't have any negative thoughts in my mind when I made my handicapping selections for the Sunday card. How I bet the card on Sunday then obviously could be impacted by getting my shirt lost on Friday, getting my shirt lost again on Saturday. But I looked at that card on Sunday and I said, the front half of this card I feel good about. The back half of it looks like chaos. If I'm going to do any damage in here, and that's the benefit of handicapping ahead, I knew the front half of the card had to be where, if I was going to do any good, was probably where it was at, and it worked out in that direction. So for me, the lessons learned and the lessons gained are stick with what you do. If you're working ahead, that can be a good thing, and you kind of know where the next turn comes, and just stick it out. I mean, you guys have all been handicapping for decades and decades, and have gone through the ups and downs. Neumeier, I think as far as like the psychology of a bettor, you're one of the most interesting people to talk about this because you're brutally honest about it. And I just think that there are so many people at your name level or at your experience level who flowery bullshit the public without a better lack of word about how successful they are and how easy the game comes to them. And I think your honesty is appreciated in these fields. This game can be tough.
Yeah, it's impossible. No, it's not impossible. If you can hold your head above water, I think you're doing a pretty good job because it is very difficult. And so as a handicapper, what I try to do, and I've mentioned this a lot in night school, in that I try to cut down as many variables as I can. And what I mean by variables is sloppy tracks or soft turf or whatever. And it can get dicey. I understand that. Patience is important. You're right. I've been around a lot of athletes. I've interviewed a lot. I've been a reporter in, God only knows, football, hockey, and we hear the word confidence from athletes. So when I hear that term, I kind of roll my eyes in my head and say, another cliche, blah, 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 blah. But I think if you bet that way, it's patient number one, which is important. And the confidence comes in is when you look at a race. Are you really sure? Are you almost sure? Or are you guessing? Or you're kind of sure? Well, the way I look at it is let's use a top level number, and let's say it's $50. Doesn't matter what the number is. Can be 100, can be 500, can be 10, whatever. And the way I bet, Jeremy, is that when I really love a situation or a horse, I'll bet max amount, whatever that number is. If I'm semi-sure, I'll bet 3/4 of that amount. If I'm, could, maybe, yes, I'll bet half that amount. Many races, I don't bet at all because I think I have no chance at them, particularly with 2-year-olds, particularly with sprinting fillies, particularly with, horses that are trying to go 3/4 to a mile and 1/16, whatever. So, again, everything that I do is based on, confidence and my feel for, nothing is sure, nothing is sacred, but you got to take a shot every once in a while as to one thing that you think might happen. Well, that's when I'll go max, and again, I'll go half max or quarter max or whatever. That's basically how I roll.
And even if you're a pick 4 or pick 5 better, and this is kind of what rolled in with me is, I like to play a small combination ticket, say like 12 combinations, 24 combinations, and then press it multiple times. So am I playing that $12 ticket once, twice, 3, 4, 5, 6 times? And that is part of the confidence level as well, just like Neumeier's talking about when he's playing with the straight wagers. Caton, for you, confidence and how things come and go in this game, how do you handle?
Well, I think, although I certainly don't bet every day that I'm handicapping, having the job that I've had and having worked in the TVG studios for years where we're handicapping cards of races on a daily basis and doing it as much as you do, Jeremy, in advance, has taught me more than anything how important it is to kind of stay the course and not get discouraged because of one bad day or even a few bad days, because I know for sure that it comes back around. And, if it's a longer meet, you adjust as you see things developing, but do it gradually. It's to have knee-jerk reactions is almost always, or at least in my experience, has been a mistake. I try not to react versus I like to just sit and take a look at it and soak it in and kind of see if I've been doing something wrong or if it hasn't been working, not picking any winners. I just can't see it. Does that change as we go? Because then if you change your handicapping up and then it was an exception, similar to Keeneland, what happened in those first couple of days, then you lose the opportunity to get back what you've lost. It's just an up and down type of flow, much like everything else that you go through. And especially at boutique meets, I think, like Keeneland, shorter meets, even Saratoga, I think it's a huge mistake to just react to bad days versus stay the course. Continue doing what you're doing. You may adjust your bankroll a little bit if you've been losing a lot, but if you don't keep diving back, you're going to miss your opportunity. And this, I think you're going to see more and more meets, for the most part, like Keeneland, where the mix of horsemen changes frequently, because this has become a much more equal game, I think, where instead of major dominant tracks, I think you see parity. You see some lesser horses and you see some better racing every place you go. And good horses can come from anywhere and good trainers can come from anywhere. So with a few exceptions, I really think that you are going to see it changing, the complexion of who's at the meet changing. So you kind of have to be kind to yourself if you don't catch it right away, because if you keep applying your handicapping skills, and it'll come back around for sure. And the Keeneland especially was the meet that I think that can be very hard to do at, given what we saw the first couple of days. And I didn't see anything, but then boom, one horse you like a lot comes through and it pays, double digits, and that kind of makes up for it. It only takes one or two to make up for a poor start. If you've had one or two bad days and you have one or two winners and they pay well enough, you can be in pretty good shape going forward. So stay the course has always been my motto.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, it only takes one, and especially one can make up for a lot when, say, you've run a 1-for-21 streak like I was doing. You're not betting all 21 of those losers, hopefully. You're picking your spots. Patience paired up with staying the course can be very valuable. Brian, I think you have a unique perspective of this because for the past several years, you've worked some long meets. Arlington 3.5, 4 months, and then going into Fairgrounds. That's a good solid 6-month straight run almost at Fairgrounds. Your confidence has to come and go and be built upon, I would imagine, in longer meets like that.
Yeah, I was taking some notes while Neumeier and you and Caton were talking, and that's really what I wanted to talk about because, especially at Fairgrounds, we were drawing a week in advance, and with, some freelance stuff and everything I had going on in the communications role as well, it was cool. They drew a card. I'm going to get through it, and basically I would have my selections all set up 4, 5, sometimes 6 days in advance, and then you're 4 days into a race week, and you've gone, 2 for 36, and you're stuck with selections you made a week ago. So there was nothing for me that really sort of boosted and decreased my confidence in really wild swings more than being the racing analyst at Arlington and at Fairgrounds because, it's an extreme example of which I think that, kind of everybody on this show tonight has been in some way or the other of having to do every race every day. And for me, that helped me in a lot of ways very quickly kind of expose some flaws in my handicapping, races I thought maybe I was really good at, I learned I wasn't as good at, and that's really benefited me over the course of several years. But really, I mean, your example from opening weekend at Keeneland is really kind of how I got through some of those Fairgrounds meets, knowing that, I knew the circuit. That was my circuit before I went to work down in New Orleans, and knowing that, it was going to come around because I was putting in the work, I was doing the process the way that it brought me success in the past, and I've been honest. I've always felt that I was better on kind of sleepy Thursday cards than I was on grade 1 Saturdays anywhere around the country. But long story short, it really is just a matter of kind of being honest with yourself, but at the same time really trying to stay out of your own head because, especially when you're in sometimes a public facing position, it can be a real hero or zero kind of situation. You have a great day, everybody loves you. You have a bad day, race trackers aren't afraid to tell you that right to your face. So, that I kind of boosts and decreases the confidence as well. It's hard to get out of your own head, but I do think long story short is that if you have the process right and your handicapping is sound and you found a style that works for you, it's very difficult at times to ride out those tough streaks, but knowing when to trust yourself and when to not back off of a horse you really do like just because you're in a slump, I think that is the biggest key, because that's the kind of horse, the kind of sequence, if you find one you love, that can really make up for just about as bad a streak as you can think of.
I thought that was
one other point, Spence, I just want to make before, excuse me for interrupting, is that I think that when you're in one of those funks, you like to call them, and we all have been there, that I find it beneficial just to take a few days off. Don't even get involved. Watch, read a book, watch TV, go to a movie, do whatever you need to do. The brain can only handle so much at once. And no matter how good you are going to get into a bad slump at one point. It's just the nature of gambling. It doesn't matter how great a handicapper you are. You're going to lose X amount of races in a row, whether you like it or not. And I'm interested in how the people in the panel feel about this, whether they have the same experience that I've had. My experience is when I'm in a slump or in a funk, I can feel it. I know what's going to happen. It's like a Murphy's Law. I'm not paranoid, but I know that, if I'm 0 for 15, the chances of the 16th time my horse is going to get left to the gate, or the 17th time my horse is going to get taken down. I don't know if anybody else has that feeling, but I do. I'd be interested in what the panel thinks about that.
Well, I guess I had to talk myself out of that because, and that was more, there's gambling and then there's handicapping, right? And so, as Brian said, when you're doing every single race for a meet, or that's part of your job and you have no choice, that's when you kind of learn to persevere regardless. But at the same time, that doesn't mean, as Jeremy pointed out, that you're betting every one of those races. And I will say that when you start to feel, I think you kind of have to, if you have a horse that you really, really, really liked, or an opportunity that you really like, you have to kind of talk yourself out of it. But otherwise, I agree with you, Neumeier, as far as there are times when I just feel like I just can't, nothing is quite going right. And it's not necessarily anything I'm doing, but it's still just not falling together. And then, to take a day off from betting is definitely, I think, a good thing to do. and I'm sure Brian feels this way. There are times when I wish you could take a day off from looking at the card and just start fresh with a clear mind, because there are just, after you go, for however many, for a couple of days, you really think, boy, I just need to not look at this anymore for a little while. But we unfortunately don't have that opportunity. And that's why I did learn through having to keep doing it that, and even now, that it does come back around regardless of whether you think it's going to or not, that it does eventually. It's just a matter of time.
And sometimes just put an autopsy on a race, go back, dissect it, see what happened, put some horses in a horses to watch list. You didn't bet the race. Maybe you shut it down in the 5th race of the card because you say, I just don't have it today. I don't feel good about the rest of the day, the card. If you're not going to go, pop in your favorite CD or go take a walk somewhere and you're going to stick it out and keep watching the races, you can be productive maybe looking for one down the line. Take some trip notes, take some situational notes, maybe do a little research in an area that you normally don't and see how that plays out with a little test sample in a particular race. We're going to take a time out in night school. When we come back, we're going to talk about track bias, the upcoming Breeders' Cup at Churchill Downs, and jockeys. Who do we ride with the money on the line? Stay with us.
And we'll be right back with more Night School.
Next on FAQ 60, problem horses. Sometimes a horse can be his own worst enemy. Other times, he's a victim of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Determining which horses simply have bad luck and which ones are bad actors is the key to identifying problem horses. A horse who has trouble comments in more than half of his races is a red flag. Look for a common thread in the comments. Repeat comments can be a sign that the horse is a bad actor. Comments that mix offenses, bumped both sides start, or shied from rival can indicate simply bad racing luck. Also, notice if similar trouble comments appear when breaking from certain post positions, which can be a sign of a horse who has some self-made issues. This FAQ 60 is brought to you by AQHA Racing and Horse Player Now. For more, go to AQHARacing.com.
Pick, bet, and cheer on live racing from Woodbine and Mohawk Park. Thoroughbred and harness action. The wagers are just the beginning. Watch award-winning broadcasts covering both breeds, incredible battles contested over the most unique grass course in North America. Experience the full field with over 130 thoroughbred and 160 live harness days. Get access to free handicapping material and join the ranks of Woodbine and Mohawk Park players from all over the globe. For more information, visit woodbine.com.
Do you want unlimited access to handicapping without exorbitant prices? Then Brisnet.com has you covered with a variety of plans for past performances, pedigree, and raw data. The Brisnet.com Performance Plan offers unlimited PDF past performances for just $75 per month and is available at Brisnet.com/PP. American Produce Records Online puts the pedigrees of nearly 1 million dams and more than 2 million foals at your fingertips, plus sire stats for only $275 per year, and is available at Brisnet.com/APR. The Brisnet.com data plan offers unlimited access to race day data files, perfect for handicappers with their own database or to plug into other people's programs. The data plan is just $125 per month. Visit Brisnet.com for all this information and more, and discover why Brisnet.com is the handicapper's edge.
I've never experienced anything like it. I thought to myself, this could be today. Why not today? And it was. The horse went from last to first and won by a nose. Winning the NHC changed my life. It never would have happened without TwinSpires.com. I won a TwinSpires qualifying tournament and went on to take the $1 million prize. Play at TwinSpires.com and you could be the next one to hit it big.
Welcome back to our Knights at the Round Table.
Welcome back to the October 2018 edition of Night School, the fan education and player development program from Horse Player Now. Our panel reconvenes. Jeremy Plonk, Brian W. Spencer, Caton Bredar, Bob Neumeier. We'll have Steve Byk coming up in our final segment tonight. Gang, let's talk now about track bias, real or imagined. It's one of those things that gets much bandy in the press, in the racing press, certainly the Twitter sphere. Everybody seems to think there's a track bias popping up every second of the race day. Mr. Neumeier, I know this is a topic you wanted to talk about tonight. Your thoughts on bias?
Well, I'm a little bit unusual, Jeremy.
Get out.
I've talked in the show about how I think that class is crap. I also think that bias is probably so overhyped and so overused. And if I want to see a commentator tell me about what happens when the rail is good on September 23rd, I want to take my shoe off and throw it to the screen, okay? I understand that occasionally, yes, something will happen, the rail, the outside, whatever, but typically in a race it goes like this. Speed horses always have the advantage. The universal bias is the lone speed horse, if you can find one. And that is what I look for, but rarely does it ever happen. And when it does happen, some 60-to-1 shot is liable to decide to get cute and go out and just tear up the favorite on the front end. So, speed is going to be on the inside. Close is most likely going to be on the outside. I get it. But by and large, I say, like class, Jeremy, bias is overblown, overstuffed, overused. Enough's enough, people. Come on.
Well, and it changes with the result, and it changes with the whims of the person claiming the bias in a lot of occasions. First two races on the card go to the front, everybody jumps on it. All of a sudden, by the fifth race, we're saying pretty fair track today. So I'm like you, Numi. I don't buy a lot into the bias. I know that there are situations that it happens, but I think it's a 10% of the race day thing, not an 80% of the race day thing. I don't know if I had to put a number on it. Caton, your thoughts on bias?
Well, this is one of those rare instances where I think Numi and I are on pretty much the same page, because I feel like it is the most overused, overhyped angle that there is. Now, that is not to say that there are isolated instances where there are some track conditions that are producing results more so than the horses running over the track. And I think it does happen, but they are very rare versus the norm. And I think that if you are going to, though, if you do want to play to biases or believe in biases, then you absolutely have to look way past the winner. You don't look just to see where the winners come from, but you look to see how the second and third place finishers ran. Because just because they didn't win, the bias would affect all the horses in the race, not just the winner. So I think that's the mistake people make oftentimes is they see horses on the lead winning, the first 3, 4, 5 dirt races of the day, and they say there's a speed bias. But they didn't notice that 3 of the 5 had runner-up horses that came from way back and closed like crazy and almost won the race. So, I just, if you are going to use track bias or if you believe in it, you must look at the entire field and how they ran, how their style was impacted or not impacted by the so-called bias before you draw any conclusions. Keeneland was a good example this weekend. A lot of people wanted to claim there was a speed bias right off the bat. If you did that, you didn't collect in a lot of situations. It was a track that was, as is typically the case, kind to horses that had some tactical speed, but you definitely didn't have to be on the lead to win. I'd say, if anything, there was a bit more of an emphasis on speed on the turf than there was on the dirt, and that changed by the end of the meet. And that's the thing. It usually comes around. If you watch every race on that particular surface over the course of, say, a weekend, you're going to find more often than not that you're going to see winners of all styles.
And Brian?
Well, If it's overused, I disagree. Overhyped, I disagree. I think that and maybe we're all kind of getting to something similar with what I'm about to say, but I think it's generally poorly identified track biases, which I think Caton was kind of getting at, is, when the early pick 4 at a racetrack, gets 4 speed winners, and then the early pick 4 pays $32. That's not a speed bias. It's the fact that 3 4 to 5s won and a 2 to 1 horse won. So I think that's one of the things that gets a little bit tricky, is that, it's very complicated. You have to look at the race, the way it's being run, who's winning. As Caton mentioned, is it just a conveyor belt? Is nobody making up ground behind the winner? That says to me that you've probably got a little bit more bias surface if that is happening repeatedly over the course of a card. But I think basically my problem is that it gets thrown around, especially in a quick take social media age. People are quick to jump on the bias, and on one hand, I don't blame them, because the sooner you identify it, if it is real, the better you can cash on it. But that being said, I would say that there's probably if I could see, let's say, all of the well-claimed biases that I see on, Twitter or any kind of other discussion that people are having about races as they're happening, I would say more than half of them I pretty much reject out of hand. But I think they're very real. They're very useful. And when there's an analyst that I really trust who is telling me about the speed bias that affected a race back on September 21st, I'm absolutely all ears, completely opposite of Neumeier on this one.
Well, you're just so naive, Brian. Come on, will you? Don't listen to these idiots that are just wasting time, your time, my time, Jeremy's time, Caton's time, listening to, what happened on August 30th. Come on, will you?
Neumeier, see, here's the problem, is that Neumeier, I just spent the last 5 years being a person with a day-to-day notebook of exactly what did happen on September 21st. So that's not naive. That's having lived that practice day to day, covering one circuit every race every day. So I don't think it's being naive. I don't think it's listening to any whichever name you called them, which I was for the last 5 years. But long story short, it's to each their own, but I don't think that's out of the question in any sense.
But Brian, you put a notebook together and everything.
It's more important to me. It's more important to me, Jeremy. Excuse me. Is that we pay more attention to the flow of a race than the bias of a race. And by flow, I mean quick pace, slow pace, dirt, turf. That to me is critically important, because it helps shape up what happened in the past, let alone a conveyor belt. Sure, Brian, Spence, I know it's going to happen every once in a while. I'm not naive to that part of it. But to think that, 5 days out of the week or 7 races, as a lot of people want to tell you about, is the way it is just, I watch races like a hawk, and I just don't believe in it. Sorry.
Yeah, Spence, when you talk about putting a notebook together and following an entire meet, give me a sense. If there are 20 race days in a month at a particular track, how many times do you think in that 20 days there's a bias?
To the point where I would actually use a bias, maybe 1. To the point where I would put heavy, if I'm talking about fairgrounds, to the point where I would actually say there was a speed bias or a finisher's bias, maybe 5% of the time. But, maybe half of the time I can have watching every race, going back over it and understanding who the horses were in it. I may have not what I would call a bias, but maybe a strong pace lean, a strong anti-speed lean. There's varying degrees, and the word bias, I think, is a major part of the problem, is that we're focusing too much on that and not on the nuances of what, the race shapes and race results that run all the way up to being a bias without ever becoming one might look like, and how those can benefit us as well.
Great conversation. Let me put 2 postscripts on this. Steve Klein for Daily Racing Film wrote a really good book about the power of early speed, and it wasn't necessarily about bias. It was the power of front-running speed. One of the great conclusions I've ever seen in a handicapping book was that he definitively put a number on it, and it was almost 70% of all races on the dirt are won by horses with early speed. So you start off with the 70-30 edge in this game, period, no matter what's underneath your feet on dirt in American racing. That's the way our races are run and the way that they're won. So keep that in mind, folks. That, look, 7 out of 10 on the dirt probably are going to be won by the front runners and horses near the front anyway. The other part that I think needs to be said about this particular situation with biases is if you don't have an extensive notebook, if you're not somebody who's taking detailed day-to-day, watching it all the time, they're going to come, they may go, you're going to miss out on it. Don't make it a major part of your handicapping. It's a supplementary factor to your handicapping, even like Brian was saying, maybe 1 out of 20, like Neumeier was saying, 0 out of 1,000. It's something that you're going to use on the occasional basis, but certainly not your day-to-day. And look, we're almost always looking for speed to start with. For our brand new players, and I probably should have started the segment with this, but the reason we talk about track biases existing is really about the compaction of the dirt surface underneath them. How firm is it and how loose is it? The more firm it is, horses just walk right over top of it and don't get fatigued as easy. There's nothing in the world that can make a horse run faster or slower based on the surface. It's just a matter of to what degree they get tired and how demanding it is. They use the old analogy like you walking on the beach. If you're far away from the tides, the sand is deep and tiring, it's hard to jog on. That's why joggers on the beach usually go down around the water where it's packed down and more firm. So did Mother Nature put extra water on the racetrack, or did the trucks going around and the racetrack's maintenance department put more water on to compact the dirt down? The harder the dirt surface is, the less tired horses get. So if I'm 5 lengths in front of you and I never get tired, chances are you will never pass me. That's what creates this quote-unquote bias. But again, no track, no situation is going to make an advantage for closers or an advantage for front runners. It's just going to expose the amount of fatigue each horse has. And so if a horse has more stamina, they get less fatigued, then it looks like a quote-unquote closer's bias. If a horse on the front end keeps going and uses their advantage because the dirt is compact down and they don't get as tired, then it looks like a quote-unquote speed bias. So it's really about the footing and not necessarily any bias. And like Brian said, it's a bad word to start with on the surface. Let's change our gears here a little bit and talk about the upcoming Breeders' Cup coming up the first weekend of November at Churchill Downs. It's a unique venue for the Breeders' Cup in recent years, but at one point in time, Churchill was really part of the rotation. This will be the 9th time the Breeders' Cup will be at Churchill Downs. And Caton, I'm sure you've covered every single one of those. Do you feel horses have an advantage at Churchill Downs with experience over the track, or is it a come one, come all welcoming kind of place?
Well, if there's any advantage, it's just from the fact that those horses are at home versus walking out of their own stalls versus, and their form is known versus the horses that come in who haven't competed regularly are shipping in. So they have to deal and contend with that, the rigors of shipping, the adjustment of settling in, if they're good at it or not good at it, and that have to, run their best over the track. I will say that for the most part, Breeders' Cup horses are the best of the best. So most of them have already gotten over that hurdle. They are class horses who are able to, with some exceptions, are able to ship to new venues and bring their A game, even if it's not maybe their own home. But I still think the only advantage would be given that you walk out of your own stall in the place that you've been all along, you might be a little bit more comfortable or confident, kind of the same as a home team advantage for a team in any sport. But that said, I think it's actually a better venue as far as offering other horses, outside horses, a good opportunity because of the weather, which is cooler versus some of the warmer climates that we've had. I know the fans love California, but sometimes if it gets real warm, that can be a disadvantage for horses who are coming in from cooler climates, and Europeans especially can react to that. I think the configuration of the track, it's been proven, is just as kind to Euros or horses coming in from other places. So I think it's actually one of the best as far as being a neutral playing ground for the Breeders' Cup.
Spence, your thoughts on the Breeders' Cup at Churchill?
You know, I'll keep it relatively short because I think I pretty much agree with Caton. You mentioned at the top of this little segment that it had been a while since Churchill had hosted a Breeders' Cup. Just got curious. Drosselmeyer, the last Breeders' Cup winner at Churchill, so it has been quite some time, 7 years. But Churchill Downs is one of those courses where I'm really not that concerned. I think it generally plays very fairly. It's not one of those really unique types of footing where, lots of horses really don't don't care for it. I think it's about as level playing field as you're going to get in the United States. And as Caton mentioned too, the weather keeps it on an even field as well for the Euros. So having success over any course, always going to be a little bit of a plus, but I think probably less of a plus for me, or less of a necessity, let's say, to have had experience or positive experiences at Churchill Downs in advance of the Breeders' Cup. I think it's fair. I think the best horses are generally going to win with the best trips.
And Bob, your thought of the Breeders' Cup under the Spires?
Yeah, I don't have any particular anything to add about this other than, the Churchill horses run better than, if they've proven that they can, do they run better at the Breeders' Cup? I'm not sure about that, to be honest with you. It's more like, what have you done for me lately? How good are you? What's your condition? Whatever. I will say one thing, though, about the Breeders' Cup day. Having been and looked at them and handicapped them for many years, I would say that we're excited about it because it's got the best horses and the big fields, and that's what we love. But at the same time, and I think last year it was proven that the results are pretty bizarre, to be honest with you. I mean, God love you if you can figure some of these races out, because I looked at last year and I thought it was inexplicable, to be honest with you. And I think I've come over the years to figure out that I used to think that cheaper races are less formful than classy races. Well, I've changed my tune. I think that cheaper races are more formful than classy races. So, again, give me a 10,000 no winners at 2 than, a grade 1 distaff, if you will. While I enjoy watching them and I enjoy reporting on them and I enjoy seeing them, no doubt, betting them is a whole other story. And I think that it's more formful, in my experience anyway, that the cheaper horses do better. I don't know why.
And you say that, and Spence mentioned that he feels more comfortable on a sleepy Thursday than a big grade 1 Saturday. And I think that's an important point, because the emotion that we have is we want to do well on the big days, right? We all love it. We can't wait to get to past performances, but those big days are difficult. And when we talk about the confidence waning or gaining in your handicapping, sometimes you just need to get back to those basics and those blue-collar races and pound them out that way. That don't judge yourself against the toughest days of handicapping. These are the toughest races in the world. They're going to be the toughest handicapping chores in the world. So if you base your success or failure as a horse player on the toughest racing days of the week, the year, of the century, it's going to make your feelings feel like you're inferior. And a lot of times, like Neumeier said, the 10,000 claimer plays more straightforward than the grade 1. Spence enjoys a Thursday more than a Saturday afternoon in a lot of cases. So keep that in mind as a horse player. Don't overemphasize your success or failure on the big days. There are 4 or 5 racing days in each week at almost any venue. Let's talk now about our final topic of the night, and that is jockeys. And who do we want to ride with the big money on the line? Because we're getting to those kind of races. I mean, Breeders' Cup is coming up. They call him Big Money Mike Smith. He's won more Breeders' Cup races than anyone. He's kind of the guy now, but is he at the twilight of his career where you still want Mike Smith as your number 1 guy? Let's let Brian start this one off. Spence, who would you ride with the money on the line?
I've got a twofold answer here. I'm not a huge jockey guy. I've said that for quite some time. I don't generally care on a day-to-day basis, more or less, who's riding a horse that I'm trying to bet on. But I think that, if it comes down to, me needing a ticket to cash, I think that, the guy that I don't think he's very flashy. He's obviously a top-tier jockey, but Javier Castellano, he goes out there and he's going to give you a chance to win the race. And I think that he's a guy that I don't talk about a lot. I don't build him up a lot, but push comes to shove, time and time again, Javier Castellano going to be there with a good ride and going to give you a chance to win that race. And a guy whose name probably doesn't quite get up to those high levels at this point, but one who I trust implicitly is Jose Valdivia Jr. From getting to know him and getting to talk to him. The way he sees a race is very smart, and I think that that's important to me. So when I'm talking about the way I would like Javier on a horse, because I know he's going to put that horse at least with a chance to win. Same goes for Jose Valdivia Jr., maybe a little bit more under the radar guy at this point in time. But grade 1, big money on the line, Javier Castellano for me.
Caton, what about you? I know it's Florent Giroux and everybody else, but with your family bias, of course, your husband, the agent for Florent. But if you couldn't get Florent on your horse, who would you have?
I know this is going to sound like a cop-out, but I truly want whatever jockey has the comfort level with the horse and the experience and the confidence of the trainer and the connections. And I believe that first-time riders have done very well in the Breeders' Cup. I mean, riding in their first Breeders' Cup, Florent, a case in point, he was not nearly as experienced or polished or established when he came to the Breeders' Cup with Work All Week. And I bet very few people in California had ever heard of him. But he knew the horse, and he knew that Roger Brueggemann had confidence in him. And when the money was on the line, it was absolutely no sweat because he did what he needed to do and won the race. And I think that of many jockeys, I just want a jockey that knows the horse, that has confidence in the horse and confidence in their own abilities. And I think a lot of jockeys are capable of winning Breeders' Cup races if they got the chance.
And Bob?
Well, I think it's a very personal issue for most of us. And I think all of us here, well, some of us anyway, would have their favorites, and some have their, what I would call their curses. For me, to make this personal on my end, I would say that from a trainer point of view, I'm probably 0 for 5,000 with Mark Casse. From a jockey point of view, I'm probably about 0 for 2,800 with Julien Leparoux. However, my favorite, who I am very, very keen on and who I win with as best as when I have the most confidence in, I should say, is Mr. Flavien Prat of Southern California. Mm-hmm. I think he's impeccable either on the dirt, particularly on turf. So if I had all the money in the world and I wanted my horse to win the Breeders' Cup Classic, I would try to get Mr. Flavien Prat on my steed.
And you may be getting him on some more live shots this year than he has in the past. He's really risen to the top of the ranks and is going to get a lot more of those A-list mounts. For me, it's an old-timer. Johnny Velazquez is one of those guys that I think he has been underrated in his career because he's ridden so long first call for Todd Pletcher since, the early 2000s that people take him for granted. But you very rarely have ever heard bad ride from John Velazquez, and that's kind of what I want when you're talking about what one guy isn't going to make a mistake. Has John Velazquez had those mounts in his career that you said, can you even define what is like his greatest ride ever? You can't, but he's a Hall of Famer. He's won all these races, and to me, that just means he's so steady, and that's what I want with the money on the line. It is interesting, though, that we talk about like young riders, first-time Breeders' Cup riders. The discussion in sports you hear a lot nowadays, and we're all fans of major sports, is that sometimes these young players walk into a situation and they're not scared because they don't feel any pressure. They don't have the pressure of, okay, I'm now 0 for 15 in this event, or we've been here 3 times before and lost in the Final Four. That sometimes just young talent is better than experience that's kind of questioning their confidence. And so maybe some of these young guys, a Pratt just comes on the scene, or Florent, like Caton was talking about in his first Breeders' Cup. Experience, Neumeier, you talked to a lot of athletes over the years. Would you rather have experience or talent that's just kind of unbridled?
I'd rather have talent, no doubt about it, Jeremy. It's interesting here that the panel seems to believe, and I believe this as well, and Spence does, and even Caton pointed out that she has confidence in a lot of professional riders, and that there's not one over another. And Spence said he's not a jock guy. Well, actually, neither am I, to be honest with you, other than my cursed guy. That I think that, by and large, they can do a good professional job. But when you look at the tote board, man alive, that's where you see the difference, because I think the average player that walks through the turnstile is going to bury the Ortiz brothers on the board, is going to bury, unfortunately, Flavien Prat on the board, and you can just see it on the tote. Because if you look at the horse, you say, well, this horse should be 3-1. Well, if Jose Ortiz is on it, it's going to be 8-5. I got news for it. It's just the way it is. And I think you can use that to your advantage/disadvantage by avoiding, quote, the big name riders. They're going to attract money that may not be there, but they're only there, that big money is only there because they have a name to follow. And so I would watch that very, very closely, much like Chad Brown or Todd Pletcher or Bob Baffert when they train. Chances are I'm going to go elsewhere because I know that, they should be 3-1 on the board. Instead, they're 6-5.
And that money follows top riders from Turf Paradise to Turfway to Charlestown to the Breeders' Cup. It happens on every circuit, and it's a lot of what Bob was just talking about. We're going to pull up here on this edition of Night School with our panel. When we come back, Steve Byk will join Brian Spencer to talk about his thoughts on tonight's topics and more. Stay with us.
And we'll be right back with more Night School.
Hey, what's going on? Mikey here, and I'm going to tell you about an offer from my good friends at ExpressBet. Let's be honest, we know you love playing the races, but you can't always make it to the track. Sometimes life just gets in the way of a good bet. Well, what if I told you about a place where you never miss a bet and you start with house money? You'd say I'm crazy, right? Well, not at ExpressBet. Your first $100 are on them. That's right. Sign up with expressbet.com using promo code XBRadio, bet $100, and they'll deposit $100 back into your account the very next day. Hey, plus you could get an extra $25 if you use Express Fund Direct Deposit. You see what I mean? House money for betting the races. It's that easy. Check it out at expressbet.com to learn more. And don't forget to sign up with promo code XBRadio. You're gonna love it. And that's a Mikey guarantee. Must be 18 years or older and 21 years old in certain states to open an account with ExpressBet and reside in a state where such activity is legal. Void where prohibited. National Gambling Support Line 800-522-4700.
Catch the buzz. Horseplayer Now is popular handicapping tour returns and puts our handicappers to work for you in a new and improved format in 2018. Team grid picks, feature race analysis, Bob Neumeier's stats and sheets plays, consensus team gimmicks captained by Caton Bredar, and analysis of 6 major tracks in each issue provided by the Horseplayer Now team. Purchase individual editions or subscribe for the remainder of 2018 and save over 60%. Our eyes, your prize. To learn more about the buzz, view sample reports, and subscribe, visit horseplayernow.com.
Some folks like to bet on the horses. Some like to bet on the games. Some folks like to bet on their phone. And some like to bet from their suite. So what's your best bet? All of the above. No matter how you like to bet, Remington Park is your best bet yet. With world-class horse racing, OKC's newest casino, and online suite booking now available. Remington Park, it's your best bet yet.
Strategize, analyze, select. Join Keeneland Select to bet on racing from around the world on your computer, tablet, or smartphone, anytime, anywhere. Featuring the best rewards in racing, free past performances, live video, race replays, and more. Plus, Keeneland Select invests a portion of its profits back into the sport. Join Keeneland Select today and earn a $150 sign-up bonus at KeenelandSelect.com. Dedicated to the sport and dedicated to the players.
Welcome back to our Nights at the Round Table.
Welcome back into Night School. Happy to be joined again by Steve Byk to close out our show. And Steve, one of the things we talked about towards the end of tonight's episode was the fact that the Breeders' Cup going to be back at Churchill Downs, formerly a very regular portion of that Breeders' Cup circuit, hasn't been there since 2011. So we were kind of talking about what that means as far as, are you looking for horses who handle Churchill? Do you think it doesn't matter if horses haven't raced there in the past? What are you going to be keeping an eye on specific to the fact that the Breeders' Cup will be at Churchill this year when you're looking to kind of size up the contenders coming into this year's big event?
Well, Churchill, by all rights, Churchill is maybe the best venue and the fairest venue for the Cup. And there's a few elements that kind of fit the design of the Cup. I mean, first of all, Churchill is the best facility for, and has historically had the best crowds. I mean, you can put 75,000 in there 2 days in a row if need be. I mean, Friday's never as big as Saturday, but Churchill has historically had the best crowd. So the atmosphere in there, and of course the way Churchill, 75,000 for them is a joke. I mean, the building's half full. So and the way they handle the crowd is second to none. Then the turf course is particularly fair at this time of year. It's interesting that this comes up because given how much wet weather we've had, and that there's an assumption that I think that people are already making that it's going to be off-going when we get to Churchill. And historically, interestingly, the courses for the Breeders' Cups, the 8 of them at Churchill Downs, they've never been worse than good. In '88, it was good, and in 2011, it was good. And unfortunately, it suited Court Vision just a little bit too much. We're still looking for Tour Allure to win that photograph. The course was firm in 91, 94, 98, 2000, 2006, and 2010. So don't go in mentally, in these weeks leading up, assuming that it'll be soft, they're yielding, and the Euros are going to love it. It's typically fair for the Euros at Churchill, but don't preclude that the going will be less than a solid footing where turf horses can dig their toes in and get around well. So that's number one. And then, of course, there's that main track that is famously not laden with clay, but the clay content historically has certainly elevated certain kinds of horses. And there will be runners that are, uniquely successful at Churchill. And look at the most glaring horse that comes to mind, and it's kind of curious, Limousine Liberal, who's 5 for 6 at Churchill, and yet he trains at Keeneland. He turns in 58-second training times at Keeneland, and has had all kinds of trouble winning at Keeneland. It's a curiosity. But he comes over across I-64 and is murder at the Downs. So you can also think about how about Nacho Correas, Blue Prize, who just won the Spinster on Saturday. She's murder at Churchill. And she's a horse that people are going to look at, and on figures, she's not going to necessarily stack up against Monomoy Girl and Abel Tasman. So she'll be a square price. Horses that get over that surface, that have proven form at Churchill, they get extra credit in a big way. And I would also note that it's the one place these days where the one-turn dirt mile configuration, which was the intention of the Breeders' Cup initially, they wanted to have a Met Mile style, a Cigar Mile style one-turn mile. And that's an important consideration, considering that, most recently at Del Mar, Keeneland, and Santa Anita, we've been running 2-turn miles. So there are some major, I think, considerations. The footing on the main track, certain horses, certain kinds of dirt horses really excel. There'll be a lot of horses that train are going to be running out of their own stalls at Churchill. Always a positive. And I would also have to consider, all the international runners that are going to run in the Classic, that are, horses that have shown good form on grass. You've got the Mendelssohn Equation and Thunder Snow, Toast of New York. These are all horses that, very well could excel. I mean, obviously, Mendelssohn, curiously, in Thunder Snow, famously underperformed, historically underperformed, and yet I think either one of them is eligible to win the Classic. So there's a lot of elements of running this at Churchill that I think will make for tremendous fodder and discussion and analysis points. And I love it at Santa Anita and I love it at Churchill. And when we get back to Belmont in 10 years, as soon as the renovation's done, I'll love it at Belmont. Those are the three venues where this event absolutely thrives.
And a really good set of points there as far as the turf course conditions go, because we always talk about, as opposed to the racing when they hold the Breeders' Cup in California, about that cooler, balmier sort of November weather in Kentucky. And we always, I'm guilty of this too, kind of assume that the ground will be less than firm. But as you pointed out in those events held at Churchill, not necessarily the case. So we don't have to go into it planning for less than firm ground necessarily. And there's another important key to that, Brian, too. Don't forget that this is a sand-based turf course. Keeneland and Churchill have sand-based courses. It's a different kind of a turf course. And that's one of the reasons, if you've got horses that have gotten over either course historically previously, they get extra consideration, because not every turf course instantly gets over that ground. It is slightly different. And I've said this a million times. There's nothing more important to a horse than the security that they feel with their footing. And if their biggest fear in their existence is falling down, because when they fall down, it takes a lot to get up, and they're at risk for their natural predators in the wild. So instinctively, if they don't like the footing, they don't put out. And that's why horses excel in certain settings because of the footing, and also underperform. So there's a variable every time a horse comes out, and it's one of the factors that is somewhat out of our control as handicappers and players. But it's the old horse for course. They don't say that on a lark. It means something. Well, there you go. And one of the fun things we did to close out the show tonight, wanted to get your input on this before we end this episode of Night School. You're sitting on a big ticket, let's say the end of a nice pick four. If you could pick any jockey riding today, who is the one that you would have the most confidence, all other things being equal? Who do you want with the big money on the line on the back of the horse you need to win?
Joel Rosario.
Okay.
Joel Rosario.
Regardless of course or anything, just Joel's your go-to guy.
Yeah, and in fact, if you want to, equate distance, short, long, turf, dirt, Rosario, especially the second half of the year, from January to April. I'd probably pick somebody else, because it seems to take them the first third of the year to get going. But let's say for Breeders' Cup Friday and Saturday, Joel.
It always seems like on Breeders' Cup Day, or weekend rather, we always get to see at least one of those huge Rosario finishes in the stretch. So that's another name we did not get thrown in earlier. So Steve Byk says with the money on the line, he'll take Joel Rosario at least if it's past April. So this is going to wrap it up for our October edition of Night School. We appreciate everybody listening. On behalf of Bob Neumeier, Jeremy Plonk, Caton Bredar, and Steve Byk, I'm Brian W. Spencer from Horse Player Now. We appreciate you listening, and we'll be back for next month's episode, Tuesday, November 13th. We'll do a Breeders' Cup postscript and more. Appreciate you listening in to this episode of Night School. We'll talk to you again next month. Good night.